Today we're going to look at the new isms. And this refers to new ideas, many of which were born out of the French Revolution. And these are ideas that influenced politics, society, and so on. The new isms. And so again, here's your terms. Go ahead and write them down, and we will talk about them. So here you see some of the major isms of the 19th century. And for this lecture, we're mainly going to focus on conservatism, liberalism, and nationalism. But I want to take just a few moments at the beginning and touch on Romanticism. Romanticism was a direct reaction to the Industrial Revolution. It was a revolt against reason and the ideas of the Enlightenment. Like I said, it's a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, and people who didn't like the technology that came with it, the way society was transformed. To many people, it was not transformed in a better way. And so Romantics tended to praise nature over human works. Untouched nature is what they liked. They praised emotion, nature, beauty, instead of the focus on reason and science of the Industrial Revolution. And Romanticism was prevalent from the late 18th century through the mid-19th century. Authors tended to romanticize, to emphasize an adventurous and heroic past. So a lot of the Romantic works would focus on, for example, the knights of the Middle Ages. And just a few examples. Sir Walter Scott, who's known for Rob Roy and Ivanhoe. The English poet Lord Byron, and he's the one I mentioned actually went to fight in the Greek War for Independence. Much of the art of Romanticism tended to emphasize just the uncontrollable power, the unpredictability of nature. And this was a response against the ordered reason of the Enlightenment. And here you have another. These pieces were meant to evoke emotion. One common theme was shipwrecks, and this was because one of the themes of the Romantic era was just man's struggle against the awesome power of nature. John Constable tended to focus on tranquil country scenes from the English countryside. And here you see some of the remains of Tintern Abbey, a monastery which was built in 1131. So this is Romanticism, a reaction against the Industrial Revolution, a reaction against the reason of the Enlightenment. So let's look at conservatism. This became a very attractive idea for all those groups horrified by the French Revolution. Conservatism rejected the Enlightenment view based on reason, of progress, and natural rights. In fact, conservatives condemned most of the legacies of the French Revolution. Instead, they admired the established traditions and institutions of the old order. They felt these were the anchors and pillars of society. The most intellectual thinker to contribute to conservatism was Edmund Burke, the British statesman. He wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, just 1 year into the French Revolution. So he writes this book, and in it he predicts that the French... Next we have liberalism. Liberalism aspired to carry out the promise of the Enlightenment. John Stuart Mill was a British thinker and a member of Parliament. And he's important, among other things, because he helped to broaden liberalism and make it more inclusive. In 1859, he wrote a book called On Liberty. This was a defense of social freedom. In it, he stated that all adults should be able to think and act as they please, just so long as they respect the rights of others. And what we see happening is that throughout the 19th century, liberalism is going to be a force for moderate, nonviolent change through reforms. Liberals stressed the rights of individuals. 19th century liberals felt that man had unlimited capacities for self-development and improvement. As long as you're free, you can achieve whatever you desire. Personal freedom is critical. It's a prerequisite to progress. Man's purpose in life was to remove the shackles. Well, what are the shackles? Well, they're those political, legal, and economic barriers that bound people. Now, they weren't anarchists. They knew there had to be order. But what they wanted to do was maximize individual liberty while maintaining social order. They wanted to find a balance. They wanted to grant citizens as many civil liberties as possible while still recognizing the need for order. Jeremy Bentham was a British man who almost single-handedly made liberalism acceptable to everyone. He humanized it. Utilitarianism was his twist on liberal thinking. Utilitarianism states that everyone who is human seeks out pleasure and avoids pain. Calculate what's good for us based on this pleasure-pain principle, and everything else is meaningless. So you should always act to derive the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you do things that will benefit the larger part of society. For example, pass reforms, laws that will benefit them, make their lives better. And so he says that the goal is to propose measures that augment rather than diminish the community's happiness. And his idea of utilitarianism led him himself to press for social and political reforms, and then other people followed suit. He said that the aristocratic ruling elite were not interested in producing the greatest happiness of the greatest number, but instead they were interested in furthering their own narrow interests. He said that only if rulers came from the broad masses of people would the government be open to reforms based on this principle of greatest happiness. Interesting story about Jeremy Bentham. Evidently he was really eccentric, and in his will he decreed that he wanted his body to be preserved. And so it was, and the preservation techniques that they used didn't work on the head. And evidently it really messed it up and made it look pretty grotesque. You can see it there between his feet. And so the body itself actually has a wax head. Now, for years, his actual head sat at his feet, like you see in this photograph. But at some point in the 20th century, it was taken and put in a box, which was too big to fit in the glass cabinet where the body resides, and it was put on top of the cabinet. In 1975, as a prank, and this resides today, this glass case resides today in the front hall of University College of London. So you go there and he'll greet you. Well, evidently in 1975, as a prank, some students from King's College in London snuck in and stole the head. And they held it for ransom for £100 to be paid to a charity. And University College ended up paying it, and the head was returned. Now, one story goes, and this may or may not be true, that Bentham also decreed that he be able to preside over board meetings there at University College. And according to this story, he would be wheeled in, the glass case would be wheeled in, and he would preside over the meetings as a non-voting member. So, very eccentric guy. So, to sum up, liberals believed in laissez-faire in economics. Keep the government out. They supported pure creativity in the arts, no censorship. They felt property made people responsible. And they stressed the God-given rights to happiness liberty, and property. Now, liberals placed the individual above all else. They felt the individual was of the utmost importance. However, a new movement was arising that's going to blur the lines between these political theories, and this is nationalism. So we're going to talk about nationalism now. Nationalism stressed the rights of collective groups of people known as nations. It became the dominant, most powerful, and most deadly of the new isms. It caused 2 world wars in the 20th century and many smaller conflicts as well. So what is nationalism? It's an emotion. It's a sense of awareness shared by a people who have a common language, culture, and history, all of which give people a bond toward their nation. There's a deep attachment to a particular land or country, a homeland, real or imagined, genuine or mythical. An individual's primary allegiance is to the national community. Nationalism places the nation above the individual, and you can contrast that with liberalism, which places the individual above all else. For nationalists, the language, culture, and history is what's important. Well, nationalism developed out of several events and ideas that occurred and developed during the French Revolution. Some of them were the idea of popular sovereignty, government by and for the people. A national community is by and for the people. Fraternity, which emphasized the union of all French citizens despite political, religious, and social differences. A revolutionary heritage. The wars of the French Revolution created the idea of a nation in arms, total mobilization, everything and everybody working together for the common goal. It triggered several similar reactions from other groups, such as the Spanish resistance. There's also romantic nationalism, which believed that nations had unique qualities, which were expressed in folk songs, languages, and so forth. The best way to cultivate a people's unique heritage is through a national state. The idea of creating a nation-state was born out of the French Revolution as well. Nationalism sought to unify divided people who wanted their own nation-state, people who were fragmented and divided. So think of the Austrian Empire, for example. This often meant liberating territory and people under foreign rule. It forged bonds of community that transcended regional and other differences. But if nationalism unifies groups in multi-ethnic empires, nationalism could be a very disruptive force. It threatened to disrupt them into small, fragmented nation-states based on nationalities. So, nationalism was sparked by the French Revolution. There was an idea of fraternity among those who felt a common bond, brotherhood. Romanticism also helped spark the national movements. It praised the virtues and uniqueness of each national group. It was associated with the rise of an educated middle class, and at first was closely linked to liberalism. It was not appreciated in Austria. In fact, the Austrian state threatened to break apart. It spurred sentiments for governments in Latin America and many American states. So, what made people feel they belonged to a national group? Language, having a national tongue. Religion, racial characteristics, geography, history. If all these things are combined, they can become a very powerful force. Well, for the first half of the 19th century, nationalism and liberalism worked together against conservatism. By the second half of the 19th century, though, nationalism and liberalism diverged. By emphasizing the nation over the individual, liberal ideals were threatened. After 1815, a growing body of nationalist literature began to pop up. German writers in particular were obsessed with nationalism because they did not yet have a nation-state. Johann Herder was a German writer and philosopher, and he said that Germans had been so provincial or countrified that they couldn't get past it. He said they needed to get past localism to create a national sentiment. And what he's talking about is the fact that people tended to identify themselves with their own little region, their own little locality. For example, if you live here in Jacksonville, say in Mandarin, that's what you identify yourself. You're from Mandarin. You're not thinking of the bigger picture of Jacksonville, and certainly not the bigger picture of Florida or the United States. So Herder's telling the Germans, get past that idea of just your own little area and think of the larger picture of creating a nation-state. George Hegel was another German, and he believed that